I'm Ollie Lovell, and like I said, I'm really excited to have the opportunity to speak with you today about this important topic, cognitive load theory. Before I start, I'll just give you a bit of an introduction into how I got talking and listening and learning about this topic of cognitive load theory. Same way it probably has with many teachers, and that is with a quote from Dylan Wiliam. When Dylan Wiliam speaks, teachers tend to listen up, and I was no exception. So when I saw Dylan Wiliam tweet that CLT is the most important thing for teachers to know, I definitely paid attention. I started by jumping into this paper, Story of a Research Program, which is free online by John Swiller, a really great introduction to the history behind cognitive load theory. Then I read this very seminal paper from Sweller, Van Merenboer, and Fred Pass. And then I struggled with, I wouldn't say that I read first time around, but I really struggled with this text on cognitive load theory, the kind of seminal text, the book on the topic. But after reading, I still had questions. And so, as is my general tendency, I went to the source. I actually went to John Swiller. I jumped on a plane from Melbourne and flew to Sydney, and I asked John Swiller a bunch of questions I had about cognitive load theory, and then I turned those questions, the responses to those questions, into a series of blog posts. And from there, John Catt got in touch, and they asked me if I wanted to write a book about the topic. At the time, I did not feel confident in my knowledge of cognitive load theory. I was just an excited, inspired teacher, such as is the case for many attendees of ReserachED. But what I said was, if John Swiller is happy to collaborate a little bit on this project, I'm happy to take it on. And luckily enough, John was happy to collaborate on a bit of a program and a book on cognitive load theory. And so that is how the book Cognitive Load Theory in Action was born. And today I'm going to share some of the key insights from that book on the theory side, but also on the practice side. So really, we're starting off with a clear overview of the key principles of CLT. In the book, I outlined 5, and today I'm just going to go through 3 of them. And then we're going to look at some practical classroom strategies, and particularly in relation to 3 of the key recommendations from cognitive load theory. All right, so cognitive load theory, even the name sounds a bit intimidating. So when I was putting together the book, I thought, how can I make this digestible? How can I make it memorable? How can I make it easy for people to understand? And I ended up distilling the idea down into, inspired by the Jackson 5 and their song ABC. I think that's what the song's called. I distilled it down into the ABCDE of CLT. So A stands for architecture, the cognitive architecture of human memory. B is biologically primary versus biologically secondary distinction. C relates to this key idea of the distinctions of intrinsic and extraneous load, and some people talk about domain as well. D is the domains of knowledge. I won't have time to go into that one today, unfortunately. And E is elemental interactivity, which is one of my favorite ideas from cognitive load theory. So we will spend a little bit of time on that one today. So to start off with, cognitive architecture. And to really start this off, I'd like to start with a guiding question. That guiding question is, why is it that experienced teachers find it so easy to do some things that would cause novice teachers to be completely overwhelmed? Okay, that's a question. Let's hold that in the back of our minds, or should I say, let's hold that in our working memory until the end of this session, and we'll be able to answer that question just then. So here is a great diagram from Oliver Caviglioli, and this is a schematic, a clear, kind of a simplified picture of human cognitive architecture. We've got 3 components. There's the environment, and we can think of the environment as an unlimited external source of information. This is books, this is people you can ask, this presentation is in the environment for you, Googling things is in the environment, unlimited and external. When we pay attention to something, that attention actually brings the information into our working memory. And the working memory is the side of our consciousness. It's what we think with. Whenever you bring something to mind, you're holding it in your working memory. And working memory is internal because it's inside, but it's also limited. And when we think about something, when we sleep on it, when we relate it to things we already know, when we elaborate upon it, and do things like that, we move information from our working memory into our long-term memory, which is an unlimited internal source of information, or internal site of information. Now, really the key insight of cognitive load theory, or one of the key insights of cognitive load theory, can be found by playing spot the difference here. So if we look at the environment, we look at working memory, we look at long-term memory, which one is the odd one out? Hopefully you can see that the only one of these three things that is limited is working memory. And what this means is that working memory is the bottleneck of thinking. And it's a bottleneck for new information. It's not a bottleneck for all information, just new information. That's something that John Swallow really stresses. So if it is a bottleneck of thinking, how can we actually overcome complex thoughts? If we can only think of, and working memory only holds, around 7 plus or minus 2 or 4, it depends on whose research you look at, but it is a limited number of elements of information. If we can only hold, say, 7 things in mind at one time, how is it we can solve problems that have more than 7 elements? Well, this leads to one of the other key ideas of cognitive load theory, and that is we reduce working memory load of a task by chunking and automating information. What's an example of this? Well, when you first learn a really simple example is when you first learn to tie your shoes. Or I was in my t-shirt today. It was a 30-degree day here in Melbourne, and I thought I won't look very professional if I'm wearing that t-shirt. I better put some sort of a shirt on for ReserachED. And so I went and I grabbed this shirt and I put it on. And as I was buttoning it up, I was thinking, if I was a kid just learning to button this up, I would be using all of my concentration to do these buttons up. But because I've actually done this enough times, I've made this process automatic, and I've chunked and automated it. So that means that while I'm doing the buttons up, instead of thinking about doing the buttons up, I can actually think about relating this to the idea of cognitive load theory and speaking about this in the presentation that I'm about to do for ReserachED. So that's one idea of chunking and automating information, but that's a physical process. It also happens with knowledge as well. So I'm speaking right now. Right now, I'm also trying to learn German. Speaking German is a very conscious and effortful process, but hopefully once I chunk and automate certain phrases, certain words, certain responses into my long-term memory, they'll become automatic, and I'll be able to have a conversation at the same time as thinking a different thought and be able to do it much more automatically. So as we build throughout our lives, we chunk and automate more and more information, and the more things we automate, the more space that frees up in long-term memory for us to think with. So we're now well placed to answer that guiding question. The guiding question, as a reminder, was, why is it that beginning teachers find it so hard to do some things that are really, really easy for experienced teachers to do? And it's because the experienced teachers have chunked and automated those processes in long-term memory. So where a beginning teacher might explicitly need to think, all right, I'm going to cold call a student now. I don't want to choose the wrong one. I'll reach for my pop sticks. I'll pull the pop stick out. I'll think of a student. I'll call them, and then I'll make sure you ask the question before you call the student, not the other way around. That's all conscious. But for an experienced teacher, it might be automatic, and they find it really easy to do. So that the big first takeaway from cognitive load theory is knowledge chunked and automated within long-term memory is the foundation of higher order thinking. So that's architecture. C is a categorization of intrinsic and extraneous load. Let me explain this with a bit of an example. So when we think about working memory, as a teacher, that's really what we've got to deal with. We can't get students to think about anything more than they can fit in their working memory if we're talking about novel information at a time. And so what this means is that there's some things that we want them to think about when we're teaching, and there's some things that we don't want them to think about when we're teaching. The things that we want them to think about, we call intrinsic load. This is the core load or things that students can think about in working memory associated with the learning task or the learning taking place. Anything that's not related to that, we call extraneous load. And extraneous load can be anything from the way that we as teachers structure the instruction, the things that we talk about that may be unrelated. It could be something in the environment that's distracting the student, or it could be something that a peer mentions that's not related to the content. This is all extraneous. It's the fluff. And it draws attention and working memory resources away from that learning. But a key idea here, so we want students to think about the intrinsic stuff. We want them to ignore the extraneous stuff. The core idea is what is intrinsic and what is extraneous is completely related to the learning task. So, for example, if I'm teaching students how to read, pictures might not actually be intrinsic to the task because pictures don't relate to the letter sound correspondence that we're trying to help students to understand to then be able to decode words. However, that's teaching reading. However, if our learning intention is not teaching reading per se, it's actually communicating a traditional story to students, then images could actually be part of the intrinsic load, because images help to convey the core message, which is the story. So depending upon what we want to communicate to students or we want them to learn, determines what is intrinsic and what is extraneous. Now that we understand what intrinsic and extraneous load is, we're actually really, really well placed to talk about the fundamental recommendation of CLT. And that is as follows. You can read that. But for anyone at the back who's struggling to read it, in order to increase learning, reduce extraneous load, and optimize intrinsic load, let me show you what this means. So say you've got this rectangle represents working memory, and say this is standard instruction. Students are thinking a lot about the core content that's to be learned, but also there's some extraneous things. So for example, maybe the way, and I'll give you some examples of this later on, maybe the way that the question is set out on the page means that they have to kind of put it together in their working memory in a way that doesn't help their learning, but it's still taking up space in their working memory. Cognitive load theory and the recommendations from cognitive load theory help us to reduce the amount of time or the amount of cognitive capacity spent on extraneous load, which opens up and frees up more space in working memory for students to focus on the core information that we want them to learn. So what this means is we're essentially, like I've said, reducing extraneous load to make space to optimize intrinsic load. And we say optimize because sometimes if the task is too complex, we need to reduce intrinsic load, or sometimes if there's still space in working memory, we want to increase intrinsic load, but we always want to reduce extraneous load. So that's the second idea, the categories of intrinsic and extraneous load. And the third big idea of cognitive load theory is this idea of element interactivity. So the source of all intrinsic and extraneous load, no matter what it is element interactivity. And element interactivity is essentially just related to how many elements there are that we're trying to get students to think about. And when we say elements, we mean elements of new information and how many interactions there are between those elements. The more elements, the more cognitive load, and the more interactions between the elements, again, the more cognitive load. And again, we need to keep those elements, the number of elements of new information that we're introducing students to, within the capacity of working memory. If we don't, they're going to be overloaded, they're going to be confused, they're going to become demotivated, and it's not going to lead to successful learning. So as an example, if we're just teaching students what Poland is on a map, that's a task that's very low in element interactivity. Students just have to think, oh, yep, it's this area here, it's called Poland. Great, maybe there's 2 elements there. Again, it's not hard and fast how many elements there are, but as a rough idea, that might be 2 elements. However, if we're trying to teach students to find Poland on a map as a grid reference, we need to teach them what longitude is. We need to teach them what latitude is. We need to teach them that one is read off the horizontal axis, one is read off the vertical axis. We need to teach them that if Poland sits between 2 different markers on one of the axes, they need to actually interpolate and make a guess that it might not be 50, might not be 55, it might be 52.5. So you can see for this task, there's many, many more interacting elements. Therefore, this is going to be a more complex task than this is for students. Now, that may not be revolutionary. Clearly, teaching this is harder than teaching this. But what cognitive load theory enables us to do is to start to look at examples like this and questions like this through the lens of interacting elements to better analyze whether students are likely to be overwhelmed or whether they're likely not to be overwhelmed. So, for example, if we already knew that as students know what longitude and latitude is, this might be just a task that relates to grid references, and that might be manageable. If, on the other hand, we know that students don't know what longitude and latitude is, and they've never worked with grid references before, this is likely to be an overloading task. On the other hand, if they already know what grid references are, but they just don't know about longitude and latitude, again, this might be a good time to introduce this task. So you can see that by thinking about the elements and the way that they're interacting, we can get a good sense of whether our students are going to be overwhelmed or not. I'm just looking at time. I did have an example to illustrate this more, but I'm just going to skip forward to just be in the interest of time, because I really want to have time for some practical strategies for you. So some key ideas from the ABCD of CLT, and I'll just give you a second to read these. Working memory is a bottleneck of cognition. You want to chunk and automate, reduce extraneous load and optimize intrinsic load, and be aware of those elements that we're asking students to deal with. Now some time for some practical strategies. I'll do my best to get through these in the time we've got remaining. This is my definition of cognitive load theory. It's a collection of instruction recommendations based upon the science of how humans learn. And most of those instruction recommendations, some of them are due to do with optimizing intrinsic load. Remember that one part of the CLT equation, but the vast majority of them, as Sweller says here, are about reducing extraneous load. And the three things that I'll talk about today, if I do have time, are all about reducing that extraneous load. So the first idea is about redundancy. So a good example of this is from a study by Sweller and Chandler in 1991. And in this study, there were 3 experimental conditions. In one condition, students were asked to learn about blood flow within the heart and parts of the heart with a diagram that looked like this one. So it had simple arrows, it had labels, and it had a diagram of the heart. That's condition 1. In the second condition, students were given this diagram as well as this descriptive text. And in the third condition, students were given a diagram with the same descriptive text integrated within the diagram. And the question for Sweller and Chandler was, which of these 3 conditions will support students to learn most effectively? Now, being teachers and wanting to support our students, often it is our inherent belief or our instinct that providing more and more scaffolding support is going to be the most helpful things for students. But what this study revealed was actually this thing, which has since been named the redundancy effect. And that is often, well, here's a definition of it. We want to eliminate unnecessary information and not to replicate necessary information. What does that mean? Well, for the questions that Chandler and Sweller were asking students, this simple diagram actually provided all the information that those students needed. It had all of the labels. It had how the blood flowed. And that was all represented on a simple diagram. This information is redundant because it just replicates this. And similarly, these boxes are also redundant because they also replicate this same information. The students who work with this diagram, which doesn't include the redundant information, they spent less time studying it and they did better on the subsequent test. So one of the ideas of the redundancy effect is really that we have to resist and try to overcome our instinct to provide more and more information, more and more examples, and often paring things back and keeping things simple is the best way to go. One really effective way of doing that is with bulletproof definitions. I'll kind of just let you read this, but the essential idea of a bulletproof definition is when you're teaching a lesson, it's a great place to start to think, what is it that I want students to take away from this? And from that, devise a really clear and concise sentence that describes exactly what you'd like them to know. So, for example, in a science lesson that's focusing on identifying and communicating sources of experimental error, this might be your bulletproof definition. This might be the thing that you want your students to know by the end of the lesson and to be able to expand upon. In a history lesson, and in a geography lesson, just move myself for you there. Great. So as you can see, like if we think about this, if a student left my year 8 history lesson and was able to say this, the Cold War was a period of tense competition, the dates between the United States and Soviet Union without direct war between the two powers, if they were able to say that, and I was able to question them on the different elements of this, what do you mean direct war? Tell me more about these dates and what happened between them. Who was the USSR? Then that would be a really clear understanding for them. And by starting with a bulletproof definition like this, it helps us as teachers to think, when we're thinking about examples to show, YouTube videos to show, case studies to share with our students, helps us to think which one of these actually support this core idea that we're trying to convey and which of them may be redundant. So really great recommendation, especially if you're working with beginning teachers, start the lesson by designing a bulletproof definition. So that's the first idea, redundancy. The second idea I'd like to talk about or the second recommendation from cognitive load theory I'm talking about today is the split attention effect. So here it is in a phrase. And so kind of to step back and be a bit meta here, when I was writing the book Cognitive Load Theory in Action, I started by asking myself questions like, what is the bulletproof definition for this idea? And so for each of the cognitive load theory ideas, I've provided a bulletproof definition. And this is the one for split attention. Information that must be combined should be placed together in space and time. Let me give you an example of what I mean here. This is an example from actually a reader of cognitive load theory in action. Imagine, again, you're trying to teach the parts of the heart. You could have a diagram of a heart, and because, you know, it's hard to sometimes fit all the labels on the diagram, you might have arrows with these references, and then here we've got the references there. But it turns out that cognitive load theory research demonstrates to us that integrating this information with this information here actually reduces working memory capacity. So information that must be combined, the vena cava must be combined with this part of the heart here, should be placed together in space and time. What it would look like if we reduce that split attention would be this. We simply label all of those things. And this relates to another idea from the redundancy effect. Often we're tempted to provide really clear and beautiful diagrams. It might be something like this one here. But often a simpler diagram, you know, what are all these things? Are they redundant? Are they necessary? Often a simpler diagram that looks something like this is sufficient to teach those things and includes less redundant information. But so that's the split attention effect. There's a source for that. In one scenario, what about in mathematics? Well, here we go. Imagine we're asking students to find the coordinates of n, which is the midpoint of between these 2 points, and the slope of NC, which is the slope of this line here. We could have the solutions here, but then students have to go, okay, they find the coordinates of n. Where's n? Okay, n's there. 1 plus 3 over 2. Okay, that's the 1. That must be the 3, and then over 2. Okay, that's the average. You see, we're trying to integrate the information here, and we're trying to combine it with what's going on up here. If we were to integrate it, it could look more like this. We've actually shown the students exactly the steps. First, we need to find this point, and then we use that point to find the slope. Step 1, step 2, and we've also physically integrated the equations with the diagram to make it easier for students to see exactly what's going on there. And this is one example that was used from a study, and it was found that the integrated version led to more and quicker learning than the split attention version. And now one final split attention example that I often like to talk about. This is something that you'll often see in texts, but it's something that we as teachers should be very, very careful of avoiding. I'd like to give you 2 examples. Please just take 30 seconds to read this passage. I'd like you to think about how difficult or easy that passage was to interpret, and now compare the difficulty of interpreting that passage with the following. Okay, so if we think about this idea, information that must be combined should be placed together in space time. If we think about this first passage, if I asked you which passage you find more difficult to interpret, hopefully, or I would anticipate that you found this first passage harder to interpret. And that's because we say lions, tigers, and leopards are 3 of the biggest cats in the world. The first of these, all right, the first, so it's lions, inhabits grasslands and savannas. The second, what was the second? So tigers. Tigers live in forest habitat. And the third, leopards. Okay, leopards live in a variety of habitats from savannas right through to snowy mountains. So you can see what I had to do there. I was reading along, and then my attention was split. I had to go back there, going along. My attention was split again. I had to go back there and back here. The third, okay, my attention was split again. In this one, lions inhabit grassland and savannas. Tigers live in the forest environment, and leopards are found in a variety of habitats from savannas right through to the snowy mountains. So you can see here I've integrated the nouns, the subjects, with the information that relates to them, and that's reducing split attention and making it much easier to interpret. A funny story, when I was writing my book, I was thinking about how can I reduce split attention in my writing, and I tried to use this idea in my writing by saying split attention, blah, 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 split attention, blah, blah, blah. And I was writing, if you read the book, hopefully it's really, really clear. But what that meant was the copy editor said, this writing is not as as finessed as it could be. You're repeating the terms. You could just say the previously mentioned idea, or use these other terms of phrase which are already often used within writing, and they sound a bit fancy when you say the former, the latter, blah, blah, blah. And I actually had to reply to the copy editor and say, I understand that. However, I'm trying to reduce split attention and make the book as clear and concise and easily interpretable as possible for the readers. So something to think about in our classes, in our writing, in our podcasts, in our presentations and things like that. So that's split attention in reading. And this is another key idea that Sweller really wanted to emphasize. Information should only be placed together in space and time if it can't be understood in isolation. So an example here is if we're talking about Queen Elizabeth, the Queen of England, the thing that teachers might be tempted to do if they're thinking, okay, information that must be combined, placed together in place and time, they take a picture of Elizabeth, Queen Elizabeth, they put her on a map of England, and they write a name above her that says Queen Elizabeth, right? So that is putting things together in space and time. But actually, if students already know what England is, what it's represented by, you don't need to put Elizabeth on a picture of England or on a picture of the map of England, because they already know that. So it's actually redundant information. The image itself is redundant. So that's something that can be avoided. So a bit of a trap for people who are just starting out with the split attention effect. And the final idea today I wanted to share with you is reduce transience. So we've looked at reducing redundancy, reducing split attention, and finally reducing transience. Here's a bulletproof definition for you. Let me give you an example. So a question I was doing with students recently in class was this one. The question is, interpret the slope of the regression line, and they're given the regression line here of egg density and number of female moths. We also call it a line of best fit. This was in my year 12 maths class, and I said, all right, use your template, everyone, write it down. I'm going to call on someone to share their answer. So this would be one way to do it. I could just say, please share your written interpretation of the line of best fit here, Luca. And Luca could say, sure, a one female moth increase is associated with a 31.3 increase in egg density. And I could say, on the right track, Luca, just remember to start your interpretation with on average, though. And I think you forgot to include the units of the Y variable in your answer, so ensure that you do that next time too. Great. Now, that was transient. Think about this conversation that we just had. I said share it. Lucas shared something. Because I've chunked and automated a lot of this content in my long-term memory, I can actually listen to Lucas' answer, I can analyze it, and I can provide feedback. Now, that's impressive. Well, impressive for the students, probably not impressive to other teachers. It's impressive to the students, but the students can't hold Lucas' response in their working memory because they haven't chunked it or automated it. So, first of all, Lucas says this, that information's transient, it's gone. The students are like, oh, Luca just said something, but I don't really know what he said. And then I provide some feedback for Luca, but they can't relate that to what Luca just read out because they can't remember what Luca said. So when I say, include on average and you forgot the units of the Y variable, that means literally nothing to them. So what's just happened? We've just had an exchange in the classroom. Maybe Luca's benefited from it, but everyone's kind of left going, is my response right? I really don't know. So what can we do instead? Well, we have to essentially just reduce transience, reduce the amount, and I forgot to define transience. Transience is just essentially when something's here 1 second and gone the next. Apologies for that, especially for second people for whom English is a second language. Transience is just when something's here 1 second and gone the next, just like our spoken word. It's kind of there. So what could we do instead? Well, I could say, Luca, can we please take a look at your answer? I could grab my trusty document camera and I could bring Luca's book up to the front and whack it under the document camera. And I could say to all the students, can you take a read of Luca's response, please, everyone? Have a think, how would you improve it yourself? And then I could say, this looks pretty good, Luca, but just remember to start your interpretation with on average, and I could annotate that. Like I say, and I think you forgot to include the units of the Y variable of your answer. So you just include that eggs per square meter here. You can see that what I've said, my two speech bubbles, that first speech bubble and that second speech bubble, they're still gone. But what's remained for students is this definition. or is this breaking down of that idea? So avoid transients, make things permanent, make them visible for students so that they can learn from them, so they don't have to try to keep them in working memory. A summary of some ideas. I'll just pop this up and give you a chance to have a read of that because I'm on 31 minutes already. Fantastic. So today we've had a chance to look at architecture, categorization, and elements. So I did have to skip a section there. And then we jumped straight to extraneous load, redundancy, split attention, and transient information. I did only have 30 minutes today. I've covered as much as I could, hopefully delivered some value and some good ideas to you. But there is much more in the book, and there's much more out there in other resources as well. So I would encourage you to continue to explore cognitive load theory because I think it really is a treasure trove of insights for teachers. As mentioned, book Cognitive Load Theory in Action. My podcast is the Education Research Reading Room. And today, literally today, the day that I'm recording this, is the day that I'm releasing the 5-year anniversary episode, and a book's coming out about that too soon. And if you'd like to find out more, jump on ollielovell.com or tweet me at ollie_lovell, and my email is there as well. Thanks for your time and listening today. Hope you enjoy the rest of the conference, and good luck learning more about teaching and learning. See you around.